Syria's President Ahmad al-Sharaa says a deal with Israel could be days away. Welcome to this episode of Let Ali Show You. Do like, subscribe, and share this content. Syria's interim President Ahmad al-Sharaa, formerly known as al-Jolani, has said that a deal could be reached with Israel within days. Border clashes, if you can call them that, or Israeli intrusion into Syria has seen several of Syria's southern regions be in violence or completely taken control of by the Israelis. What could this mean at a time when the Americans and American envoy Barack are trying extremely hard to get a deal done, and when Syria's foreign minister has found himself in the United States as well? To get a better understanding of this, I'm joined by a former colleague who is in Damascus, Syria, war correspondent Obaida Hitto. Obaida, thank you so much for
Thank you.
speaking to us. I haven't seen you in a long time. I like the beard. Tell us first, how is the situation in Damascus, in Syria, where you're at?
The situation in Damascus is pretty calm. People are learning how to adjust to these changes that have happened. It's almost been 1 year. It's hard to imagine that time has gone by so fast since December 8th. 2024. People are still having growing pains, if you will, in terms of adjusting to the economic changes, adjusting to the social changes, adjusting to the security changes. Everything that's happening in Syria today, whether it's here in Damascus in the capital or around the country, is new to the Syrian people because they were living in a country that was being run by a dictator who ruled with an iron fist, a police state that didn't allow for any margin of freedom or freedom of speech. So people are really adjusting to these new realities. Things remain calm despite the fact that there are security challenges that the government is still trying to deal with, and in some ways struggling to deal with. The situation remains calm. People are still engaging in business. Schools are going back into session in a couple days. Businesses are operating. Public transportation hasn't improved, but it continues to operate. There are some things that have improved, like the availability of petroleum products like diesel fuel and benzene, which is allowing for people to move around, for businesses to move their products around. And so this is something that people haven't been used to over the last 15 years during the Syrian revolution until the regime was toppled. So people are adjusting to these new changes, even though not everything is great, but things are moving in a positive direction in the general sense.
You touched on a lot of issues. You mentioned sanctions. The Syrian foreign minister has headed to the United States, where he's telling them to lift whatever remaining U.S. sanctions are in place on the country at a time when the president of Syria, al-Sharaa, has said that a deal with Israel could be within days. Tell us about this, especially because Israel has been such a nefarious character in this region.
Right now, the economy is hinged, or the improvement of the economy is hinged on the Caesar Act, which is a group of sanctions that were passed into law in the United States several years ago to put pressure on the Assad regime because of a file that proved that the regime was systematically torturing and executing people in the prisons. Around more than 50,000 pictures were leaked from the prison system here, and they were presented to the international community and to lawmakers in the United States, and they decided that they were going to pass the Caesar Act. It's named after the gentleman who actually took out these pictures and took them to the United States and showed them and actually testified in front of Congress and the Senate about what he saw and documented for all of those years. Now, since the Syrian regime toppled in December, there has been a lot of talk about what are we going to do with these sanctions. At first, there was a little bit of resistance from the US saying that they weren't really ready to lift the sanctions. There were still people that were questionable in terms of international law and their previous positions and roles in different groups and non-state actors here in the region. But what happened was they were partially lifted after the U.S. President Trump visited the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and there were talks about how to bring back the Syrian government in its new form back into the international fold. There were partial lifting of sanctions. Now, that partial lifting of sanctions helped with some things, like allowing international organizations, businesses to invest in certain sectors, like the energy sector, for example, which is a huge issue hindering economic growth and development here in Syria. But those kinds of limited lifting of sanctions aren't going to solve the Syrian economic crisis. They have a huge liquidity problem. 1 out of 4 Syrians is living in poverty. The average income is $800, around $830 a year annual income per person. So people are struggling economically. It's not like everybody here is living the good life, even though there are some people who are flourishing. They've found ways to engage with the economy locally and regionally and are doing business. But that's not everybody across the board. People have lost their businesses, their homes, means of income, etc. So the question is now, is making a deal with Israel going to be enough for the US to lift the sanctions? What we're seeing actually is that in the United States, in Washington, D.C., there is huge pushback. Senator Lindsey Graham specifically is proposing that the Caesar Act actually continue and to be given more permanent status unless certain political and security conditions are met here in Damascus. On the other hand, there are efforts by the Syrian government, as you mentioned. The foreign minister, Assad al-Shaybani, is the first Syrian foreign minister to visit the United States since 1999. And he is in Washington, D.C. right now, making the rounds, visiting with many different people in the U.S. Government. He visited the Pentagon even. He's also visiting with congressmen and senators. And this is all in preparation for the upcoming UN General Assembly meeting where the Syrian President Ahmad al-Sharaa is expected to appear and even give a speech at the General Assembly. The question here is, if Damascus sits with Tel Aviv at the table and says, okay, we're ready to make a deal, is that going to lift the sanctions? I think it's not likely that those two issues are going to be connected. I think that even if Damascus sits at the table with Israel and is showing the willingness to find some kind of solution, whether it's temporary, permanent, short-term, long-term, medium-term, I don't believe that the United States is going to fully lift complete sanctions from Syria, even if they make a deal with Israel. That's because there are a lot of other factors that will be taken into account when the decision to lift the sanctions is made. One of those things is, for example, the role of Russia, which is still very much present here in Syria. They're also conducting business here in Syria. They have very good relations with the government in Damascus. They're offering military, financial, and political backing to the government here in Damascus. There have been very interesting developments in terms of the oil and gas trade. There have been shipments of Russian oil that have arrived here in Syria because one person, somebody would say that why does Syria need shipments of oil from outside of the country? But the reality is that most of the oil producing fields in Syria are still outside of Damascus's control. They're east of the Euphrates River in the areas under the control of the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, the American-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. So Damascus today does have a fuel crisis, and oil historically has been one of the main sources of income for the country, even though it was being basically stolen from the Syrian people by the Assad family and its cronies. Now Damascus has the job of trying to re-engage with the local actors and regional actors to get that very valuable resource back in its control and to be able to sell it locally and regionally and internationally and get that money back into its coffers. That's not happening yet. So Damascus has to look for willing partners to do business with them. Because of the sanctions, Unfortunately, they can't buy oil from your normal go-to places. They need to buy oil from anybody who's willing to skirt the sanctions and do business with them. And at this point, Russia is one of those actors, along with possibly other actors in the region. So even if we were to say that Israel is willing to do to sit down at the table and do a deal, and we were willing to say that Damascus is also prepared to sit down and talk and find a diplomatic way to reach a deal with Israel, there are a lot of outstanding factors that would determine whether or not the sanctions are lifted.
So many points that you raised here, some very good points as well. Very quickly, could Damascus, let's say these oil fields, if they come back in the purview of Damascus, would they be able to meet Syria's energy needs, number one? And especially with the SDF or PKK, the Syrian branch of the PKK, as we know, the YPG, or the SDF as the Americans rebranded it. What is Turkey's position and role at this moment in light of also Israelis attacking potential bases or the setup of Turkish bases in Homs and elsewhere?
Absolutely. So we're going to approach this in two parts. The first part, without getting into technicals, the short answer to your question is yes. If Damascus is able to recontrol these oil fields and the gas fields, I should say, natural gas fields, and have them under the control of the central government in Damascus, the energy resources that would be produced from them would meet Syria's domestic needs, and there would be extra to export into the global market. That's the short answer. Okay. But that's not happened yet. And why hasn't that happened yet? And that's the bridge to your second question, is because of the presence of the SDF, the Syrian wing of the PKK terror organization in the body of the SDF, but mostly represented by the YPG. Now, if you recall, a few weeks ago, I should say, the PKK announced that it was going to put down its arms and it was ending its armed struggle. Okay. But here in Syria, the YPG, its Syrian wing, has not fully committed to that same thing. They're not saying we're going to put our guns down. They're not saying we're finished with an armed struggle. They're calling for decentralized governance. They're calling for autonomous administration. They're calling for a share in these natural resources that we mentioned, the oil and natural gas specifically. They want to make a deal with Damascus, and they want Damascus to basically give up some of its sovereignty, if you will, as a central government and control over these territories and make a governance deal with them, a shared governance deal with them. Now, for Damascus, especially in the situation that they're in now, it's going to look very bad for them here locally, as well as regionally and internationally, showing that they're weak and they're giving in to this pressure from this armed group, which essentially acts like a militia, a non-state actor, and some people and some governments, like the Turkish government, consider it to be a terror organization for many decades now. And it's going to look very bad for them. And it's going to make it very difficult for Damascus to sell this to its domestic audience and even the regional and international audience. So I don't think that's something Damascus is looking for. Damascus has been insistent that the group come and join the actually, let's split it up. That the group put down its arms, join the armed forces of the Syrian government, and engage in a political process with the central government in Damascus, allowing for some form of, let's say, local governance, a robust local governance system. And that's a reflection of the government in Damascus trying to take into account all of the different ethnic groups and religious groups that are in some of these areas. Okay, there is a large Kurdish population, there's a large Christian population, there's a large population of people that are Yazidi and different other kinds of sects of local regional ethnicities and sects, religious sects. So the government is trying to play nice with everyone. They don't want to be seen as extremists as they've been labeled in the past for many years. They're trying to get out of that label, and they've made real efforts to try and get out of that label. However, the authorities in the areas east of the Euphrates River, headed by, let's say, Mazlum Abdi and people who are representing them in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, they haven't been playing ball. They are basically kowtowing. They're not giving in. They're not making any consolations. They're not making any concessions. They're saying they don't want to give up their arms. They want to govern themselves, and they want a piece of the pie, if you will, which is not going to work for Damascus. So now the question is, like you said, what is Turkey's role? There was a very interesting visit by the head of Turkish intelligence just a couple days ago here in Damascus, and it was very interesting to see the pictures that came out of that meeting. The envoy that came, the head of the Turkish intelligence and his group of officials that arrived with him as well were carrying large bags, suitcases of files. People here in Syria were talking about, wow, they have a lot of work to do. They've got all these files, really heavy suitcases, it looked like, filled with files of paperwork. So they had a lot to talk about. I'm sure it wasn't only the SDF and east of the Euphrates that they had to talk about, but what came out of that meeting were, let's say, leaks saying that the Syrian government here in Damascus has agreed to allow Turkey to help them deal with the situation as seen fit. We heard from Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, about 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, about 10 days ago, saying that we are patiently watching until the end of the year to see how the authorities east of the Euphrates are going to act. Now, there's been an operation in planning and in waiting for, let's say, several years now. The last major attempt was at the Peace Spring operation when Turkey took the areas from Tel Abyad to Ras Al Ain, just east of Ain al Arab, which is also known as Kobani. And then that operation was stopped because there was an intervention by America and Russia as well. And the major issue at that point was because of the airspace, and Turkey was using its air force to actually advance its troops and advance the Free Syrian Army at that time. And then the Americans and the Russians came together and said, please, let's not make this any worse than it already is. Let's do joint patrols. Let's make a deal and stop the violence so that more people aren't displaced, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there are new operational plans on the table to possibly move in militarily if needed. That's going to be a huge operation if it happens, because east of the Euphrates people, there are more than 5 million people living. It's a huge amount of territory, all the way from the Turkish-Syrian border in the north to the Iraqi border in the south. It's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. There's the Euphrates River dividing the territory directly in the middle. It's not connected in any kind of geographical way. There's no land bridge from one side to the next. You have to cross the Euphrates River to get into those territories. And I would like to point out here that it's not like Damascus wants to do a military operation just because they think that's the only option they have. Damascus is being forced, in my opinion, I will say here, to do a military operation, or let's say consider carrying out a military operation, because on the east side of the Euphrates River, the SDF continues to kidnap people, continues to attack villages, continues to violate people's rights, continues to occupy and steal the natural resources that belong to Damascus. And the kidnappings and the attacks on villagers is not something that's happening intermittently. It's something that's consistently happening. In the last 24 hours, there have been 2 villages, 2 separate locations just around Deir ez-Zor city on the east side of the Euphrates River that were attacked. Families that were kidnapped, young children that were taken from their homes, homes that were attacked and damaged by these fighters that are affiliated with the SDF, the Syrian wing of the YPG terror group, of the PKK terror group in the form of the YPG. So this is a very serious issue. It's not something to be taken lightly. I don't believe Damascus is taking it lightly, but it is a very sensitive issue because, first, the geographical territory that's in question, it's a huge amount of territory. I don't know the exact square kilometer area that it covers, but it's huge. It's everything from the Euphrates River all the way to the Iraqi and Turkish border in the north. Plus, there is a very valuable resource in water, the entire Euphrates River, plus water sources in the region. Third, it's because of the farming. There is a huge, huge, huge farming industry in that region, wheat as well as cotton. And then finally, and probably the most important issue, is the presence of oil and gas that Damascus desperately needs to get its books right so that it can continue to progress and rebuild the country and find a way to transition into a more positive progression for the country.
Obaida Hitto, you've touched on so many things. Finally, you've been out of Syria for almost a decade more, maybe 12 years you were out of Syria. When you left, Syria was in the middle of a civil war. You came back to Syria at the downfall. You reported on the downfall of Bashar al Assad and the fall of Damascus. A truly historical moment. As a Syrian, what are your sentiments sitting now in Damascus, almost a year since that city fell? And are you hopeful for the future? Because about 500,000 Syrians have left Turkey, for example, in the past 9 months and returned back home. So, what are your sentiments?
It's a very emotional time in Syria for everybody. Because their families are rejoining after being separated for so many years. People are coming back to find things destroyed, damaged. Um, People are finding things missing. They're finding their family members missing. They had hopes that they would return and they would find people that they had lost touch with for so many years. They're finding out people had died or were kidnapped, arrested, and their whereabouts are unknown. People lost businesses. So when you put all of these things together and you come back and you see the country in the condition that it's in, it's quite disturbing, because you would hope, because if somebody like me, I love this country. It's not someplace I grew up, but it's someplace I was always connected to, because I lived outside of the country and I spent time here as well. And I'm connected to it emotionally. I'm connected to it spiritually. I have family members that I've only recently met and gotten to know, if you can imagine. For more than 3 decades, some of these family members I'd only seen one time, and some of them only spoken to over the phone. And many people like me have also similar experiences. So this is all very emotional for everyone. But people are hopeful. People are hopeful for the first and main reason because Bashar al-Assad is out of the picture and his family and the people that were benefiting from his dictatorial rule here. Now Syrians can learn how to be Syrians. Syrians can learn how to love their neighbors. Syrians can learn how to love their own family members. People were living in a police state where they would be afraid to say their own opinion, express their own opinion in front of their own family members. That's how scared people were here in Syria before the fall of the regime. Now you find people expressing themselves, expressing their opinions about the government, about things that are happening, about local affairs, and quite freely and without the fear of any kind of repression. And I think this is the thing that gives me the most hope, even though there's a lot of work to be done here in the country. Okay, it's not things are not great, but they're good and they're going to be great. They're going to get better. There are a lot of people working extremely hard to make sure that Syria remains stable and safe and is a place where Syrians can come together and decide how they want to live, to build a new social contract, and to agree on a way that they can work together despite all of their differences, ethnically, religiously, economically, socially, and come together and create a new national identity that allows them to progress forward in a positive way and make a positive impact on the country and in the region as well. And I think there are even young Syrians here, and this is something that gives me a lot of inspiration and hope. Young Syrians that are younger than you and I, Ali, in their 20s, people who have graduated from university recently, even younger than them, kids who are in high school, and they're really now seeing the opportunity that awaits them. You can see the spark in their eyes. And I think in 20, 25 years, people are going to look at Syria as a beacon of light in the region, here in the Middle East, and then possibly around the world, because there are a lot of bright minds working on a lot of great things that I think are going to be breakthroughs, both here locally and on the global scale.
Syrians are no doubt very hardworking, extremely dynamic, And now, with a decade of experience around the world, I would say they're also prepared in some ways. But as you said, a lot of things happening. Israel, what happens with the SDF PKK, big questions. Obaida Hitto, war correspondent, former colleague, joining us from Damascus, Syria. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for your time. So, what do you guys think? Is Syria on its way up, or do you feel that there might be a repeat of the past with more violence? Do let us know in the comment section. Do like, subscribe, and share this content. I'll see you next time. Till then, take care.